the second of our faculty colloquium talks for the semester, and there are a lot of people who work hard to make that happen, and Sam is our go-to person for absolutely everything, so thank you very much, Sam, for all the effort you put into it. I want to thank Renee as well, who would be here but is in California at the moment, I believe at a conference. So she is unable to be here, but she's sort of the co-organizer with me of this faculty colloquium and then our guest speakers who come in as well. So I wanted to tell you about some very exciting upcoming talks that are happening that might interest all of you in the room. We have one more visiting speaker coming this semester. Her name is Laura Grappo from Wesleyan University, whose talk will be called Doppelgangers, Replicants, and Spectral Others, Latinxes as Monstrous Doubles in the Contemporary United States. And that will be Thursday, April 12th from 2 to 3:45 p.m. And that will be in University Hall on the 4th floor, room 4110. So if you can make that, we'll have the poster up very soon, and that should be really exciting too. And then the third of our faculty colloquia will be Professor Betsy Klima-Smith, who will be talking on the Ancillary Archive, Early American Drama Beyond the Script. That talk will be in this room Wednesday, April 25th from 2 to 3:45 p.m. Did I give you all the information you need? Okay. I also want to say a big thank you to Dan Remain, who creates the gorgeous posters that you see up. I love the one he did for your talk.
Like
and
a
I
work
think it's
of art.
terrific. Yeah.
Frame that thing.
Well, you do have a copy, right?
I did
Good,
steal
good.
one, yeah.
And you should. It's lovely. All right. So thank you. The last thank you, which I will be repeating at the end because I'm very excited about the talk, is to Joe Ramsey for volunteering to give a talk during our colloquium. He is a full-time lecturer here at UMass Boston in English and American Studies. I should say Dr. Joe Ramsey. And he's now finishing his 5th year here. His most recent publications include an edited collection, Scalo-activism.
Scalactivism, yeah.
I knew I wasn't going to pronounce it right.
Yeah, there you go.
But you get the idea, Scalactivism. And the subtitle is Reflections on Transforming Praxis in and Beyond the Classroom. And he's got some copies, right, in the back if anyone is interested in them. As well as something called Edmund's Invitation, which is a reflection on the work of our UMB colleague, Edmund Caldwell. And I'm not sure if you're talking about Edmund in the talk at all, but
not today. Yeah.
Okay, that's all right.
Right,
that's all right.
Edmund, who did pass away last summer, and his work is very much worth his life worth remembering today. So I'm wearing this T-shirt under here, actually. Yeah.
Very
anyway.
nice.
Yeah.
So Joe is not just a teacher, but does a lot of scholarly editing, a lot of writing, political writing, as well as scholarly writing. He's edited 4 book-length collections and essays on issues of literature, culture, social justice, and leftist politics, and serves on the editorial board of the journal Socialism and Democracy and Cultural Logic. His social criticism, and now I'm sorry, I'm just going to read because I'll...
Yeah, do it. That's what I'm
His
gonna
social criticism has appeared frequently in publications such as Counterpunch, Inside Higher Education, Jacobin, and Slate, and his literary criticism has appeared in Scribner's American Writers Series, Minnesota Review, Red Wedge Magazine's Mediations, and the book volume Lineages of the Literary Left. His primary research these days is focusing on the published and unpublished writings of Richard Wright, not Langston Hughes, though if you want to ask questions about Langston Hughes, I'm sure he'd be delighted to take them. And that's my mental hiccup. And he asks us to rethink a range of issues concerning the crucial writer's relationship to both the mid-20th century left and to contemporary U.S. society and social movements. In addition to writing and teaching, Joe works on campus as a union and community organizer, representing non-tenure track faculty on the executive committee of the Faculty Staff Union, while also working with the Anti-Austerity Coalition to Save UMB. He lives right up the street in Dorchester, and he welcomes all questions and comments at his email, which I will put up here. It's jgramsey@gmail.com. And without further ado.
Great. Thank you very
Jonesy.
much. Thank you very much, Louise. I thank you all for being here today. I think I know most of you. Many of you know each other. Many of you already have my email, but those of you who don't, if you have to duck out early and you want to follow up. I want to have a few words of thanks myself. Of course, I want to thank Louise and Renee for organizing the series, and Louise especially for doing a great deal of legwork to get this talk scheduled and then get it rescheduled after we had a snow day with no snow last week. So we're grateful we even have this room at all, even if now we have all these Wednesday conflicts on campus to compete with. I also want to thank Sam for everything she does for the department, but specifically for this series and for this talk, helping us to get this room on short notice and things of that nature. I also want to thank Dan Romine as well for the beautiful poster. There we go for the internet. Dan, it's a work of art, and I wish he was here, but hopefully he'll be able to see the talk and see me that I'm thanking him. I also need to thank a few people who have contributed materially to this, the thought that is reflected in this paper. As a friend once just recently wrote, writing is individual, but thinking is collective. And so I want to give shout-outs to a couple people that are in the room actually right now who have really shaped the thought or contributed positively to the thought that has gone into this paper. Of course, the errors are all mine, but the good stuff's collective. So I want to thank Linda Liu, who's also Professor Linda Liu, who's also taping this talk right now. So thanks on both fronts. I also want to thank my student Julio Ruiz, who has taught me some things about Richard Wright through the course of doing an independent study on Wright together, as well as Victor Wallace, who's exemplary, socialist intellectual, also the managing editor of Socialism and Democracy. And I want to thank my students and community allies who have come out today. So thank you all for being here, and I hope we can have a conversation as well as hearing a talk. How many of you have read Richard Wright? Okay, so how many of you have read Black Boy? The autobiography, by which might mean, how many of you have read Black Boy, including American Hunger, the northern section? I know you have, right? And hopefully Isaiah will soon. Okay, so it's good to know. Great. I want to open with a couple points before I read. I'm going to read a paper that runs about 23 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time to discuss. But first I want to make 2 points. One is clarifying some things that are in the title that I'm not going to talk about, just kind of locking off the scope of this talk a little bit. The title of the talk is How Richard Wright Revised His Radicalism. That might make it sound like I'm going to talk about the whole sweep of the life of Richard Wright and how he changed his kind of radical thought throughout his whole life. That's a very interesting topic, and I hope we can get into that, and certainly should, if not here, then sometime. But today's remarks are going to be mainly focused on how Richard Wright revised, we might say, his quote-unquote red decade, his openly communist decade of the 1930s and 40s, specifically by revising, as the subtitle of the talk implies, his famous autobiography, Black Boy / American Hunger. Okay, so that's the scope. Also, I want to put a little pressure on the first word of the title. How I'm not going to be talking about how he revised in the sense of like what year did he change what was because of his editor, his publisher, the Book of the Month Club. I'm not going to be so much talking about the process yet, although I have some hypotheses about that and certainly some speculations. And in fact, that's I would say the next part of this project, besides writing up what I've learned, is in fact corroborating what I've been looking at between the different drafts and his correspondence and other things that can actually help us to kind of put the editing process in motion. Okay, so that's just two notes about what I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to make quickly 3 quick points, very quick, just about how this relates to kind of larger issues that might help, maybe things we can get into in the Q&A. Just 3 very quick points. I think many of us have heard about this. I'm not going to go on at length about it, but in light of various crises that the world has been facing, from ecological crises to economic inequality to various trends that have been affecting our society, interest in socialism and in some kind of anti-capitalist society is up, right? There's been a number of polls that have documented this, particularly among so-called millennials, people under 30. I'm not going to go on with all the statistics. It's very Googleable, and then some of you are already familiar. But I think that is a very important sign of the moment we're in, and it's in that context that I think the work that I'm doing on Richard Wright is of particular kind of moment. The second point I want to make is that a lot of this interest in socialism, particularly among young folks, has flowed into organizations and into publications. For instance, the Democratic Socialists of America, the publication Jacobin publications and groups that define their notion of socialism very much, I would say, through a disavowal and distancing from the 19th and 20th century history of actually existing communism in the world, right? So you can find, Jacobin in a debate with a libertarian publication in New York City, sold-out debate, and the whole, discussion, the Jacobin position is premised on, we're not like those murderous communists, we're talking about something new and fresh, right? And this is a very, I think, understandable and rhetorical maneuver in the United States of America to even get any kind of post-capitalist, anti-capitalist thoughts heard at all. But I guess I want to argue today that we should be wary of the limits and problems of that move. Right? Which brings me to my third point, which is that I throw myself in to a large degree with people such as the French philosopher Alain Badiou, we've talked a little bit about him in class, who argue not for romanticizing the past communist attempts, but by continuing to take responsibility for that history and the project of creating a classless society, and not disavowing that history, but rather studying it to learn from it, to identify the particular points where things went well and where they didn't, and to devise an egalitarian project for the 21st century, which, whatever it may call itself, learns from the actual experience of people trying to bring about a classless, equal, egalitarian world, rather than disavowing it and failing to learn that history. Okay? So it's in that context that I think, and we can talk about all those big issues if you want later. Hopefully that gives some access even to people who don't know Richard Wright so well. Okay. All right, 23 more minutes, and then you can tell me what you think. It is perhaps one of the best-kept secrets of American literary history that substantial numbers of black writers had a significant relationship with the pro-communist left. So writes critic Barbara Foley in Wrestling with the Left, her groundbreaking study of how longtime communist Ralph Ellison turned Invisible Man into the anti-communist American masterpiece we now know it to be. Alan Wald, arguably the walking encyclopedia of the American literary left, has written similarly that, quote, sympathy for the party was so prevalent that it is plausible to acknowledge African-American literary communism as a major component of mid-20th century culture, period. Wald adds, however, that no prominent African-American writer, not even Langston Hughes, who's on the list, other than Richard Wright, were really willing to risk the exposure of appearing in public as acknowledged members of the Communist Party. Of all mid-20th century U.S. writers, not just African-American writers, who contributed to the international communist movement, Richard Wright was among the most influential and widely known, both as writer and as communist. Wright remains rather unique, not only for proclaiming his affiliation with and later his sharp separation from the party so publicly, but also for achieving such broad national and international recognition and commercial success, in particular for his controversial best-selling novel Native Son from 1940 and his memoir Black Boy published in 1945, both of which can still be found on many high school syllabi. Just my personal opinion, Native Son and Black Boy remain two of the most gripping literary accounts we have of the struggle against not only the brutality of white supremacy, racial segregation, and economic deprivation, but also the many complex responses that oppression can give rise to among oppressed people themselves. We now know that Richard Wright's involvement with the Communist Party of the United States, I'll refer to it as the CPUSA, spanned more than a decade from the early 1930s to the mid-1940s, arguably the most creative decade of Wright's life. His involvement was wide-ranging and deep, complex and sustained. I'm not going to review all the writings now, but it's a very productive and prolific period. And yet most contemporary scholarship, when it positions Wright in relation to communism at all, continues to emphasize Wright's conflicts with communism rather than that relationship's apparent productivity. See James Smethurst for a discussion of this at length. So even if we are taught about Wright's involvement with communism, the tale is told as one of heartbreak and disappointment, blockage and breakthrough, and breakdown, although breakthrough when he leaves the party, a cautionary tale of what to avoid rather than an inspirational lesson of what might be done, what was done if we learn the lessons from previous attempts. The fact remains that from his influential 1937 essay, Blueprint for Negro Writing, to his collection of novellas known as Uncle Tom's Children from 1938, one of the most powerful accounts of Jim Crow terrorism and anti-racist resistance we have in the pages of American literature, to the posthumously published experimental Laud Today, to Native Son, to 12 Million Black Voices, which was his collective photo history of the Great Migration of African Americans out of the U.S. South. Wright's major works were all deeply informed by his long-standing and fruitful if fraught, relationship to Marxism, communism, as that was mediated through the CPUSA. Right? It wasn't Marxism in general, right? It was mediated through the organizational connections that he had. Overemphasizing, thus, the conflicts with the CP risks imparting a misleading one-sided view. Rather than focus today, however, on the early Wright's work, which are often explicitly or implicitly pro-communist from the 1930s, though I recommend them, I'd like to share some thoughts based on my research into the Wright text that is, perhaps more than any other, responsible for reproducing this one-sided conflict narrative of Richard Wright's relationship to Marxism, communism, and the CPUSA. That text is American Hunger, also published as part 2 of Black Boy, generally now under the title The Horror and the Glory. And if people want to see how it's often formulated, I will just pass that around. You can also see how much I've marked up the text. Has anybody, and again, who here has read that second half? I believe Julio has, right? That's so, okay, not everybody. I do recommend it, obviously. Indeed, if Barbara Foley has shown us how Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, with its infamously hostile depiction of the Brotherhood, functions as Exhibit A for the ideological lesson, and how communism and Marxism are ostensibly incompatible with humanity in general and with African American interests in particular, American Hunger has functioned as something like Exhibit B or Exhibit C in American literary history. Over the past 2 years, I have been closely comparing the published version of Wright's autobiography with the unpublished drafts of this famous work, the drafts held at the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale University. Most studies of Wright continue to cite the published autobiography as a more or less solid foundation of biographical fact. Yet, to date, my close reading of the early unpublished drafts of Black Boy, originally entitled Black Confession, which itself is, I think, fascinating. 3 drafts of the text are under that title, has yielded a growing list of the many ways in which the early drafts of Wright's autobiography differ from the published version. Some of these textual changes are minor, of course, stylistic, etc. However, many of the points of difference are substantial, with serious implications for how we grasp Wright's relationship to important issues, from his views of race, class, gender, and sexuality, family and religion, to his views of socialism and the legacies of the Russian Revolution, to his own experiences in the party, to what he saw more generally as the prospects and obstacles for radical organizing within the United States, and the specific role he saw for all art, literature, and culture within that movement. I have to date a list of 40 major changes at this point. I mean major conceptual changes, not just passages. I have a list of them here if we want to get into it later. Most of them which pertain to the second half of Black Boy American Hunger, right? The second half, the Chicago section, the northern section, which deals mostly with Wright's political organizing and his kind of political consciousness and literary development in the North. In both the published and unpublished versions, this latter half of the autobiography dealing with Wright's time in Chicago is a decidedly mixed account of Wright's experience in and around the left movement, juxtaposing moments of great enthusiasm and optimism with sharp criticisms and even outright, maybe even despair, you could say. In neither work does he give us some portrait of a harmonious, perfectly working radical organization, whatever that might mean. For example, both versions close with a version of this story, the young Wright being physically accosted and violently tossed headfirst out of a Chicago May Day march, allegedly in 1936, by none other than his erstwhile comrades, even as he listens approvingly after he's thrown out, right, to the lyrics of the International being sung by the workers passing by, right? Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, right? Wright is approving of the lyrics, and even as he's being thrown on his ass, right, out of the march, right? It's worth pointing out that white former comrades do the tossing, while black former comrades look on in silence, too ashamed to admit that they actually invited Wright into the march in the first place. It's a powerful closing scene that might stand as a synecdoche, a symbolic emblem for the statement American Hunger is offering as a whole about Wright's relationship with communism in general. Despite his best efforts and ideals, to offer the party his full talents, his younger self ends up being forcefully rejected and ejected, forced to retreat to a more solitary path as a writer, quote, flinging words into the dark and hoping for an echo, as he puts it on the memoir's closing page. We should note that in both versions, Wright diagnoses the CPUSA, right, the Communist Party of the United States of America's problem as neither its communist outlook nor its disciplined party form. He explicitly approves of both, but rather its Americanness. Right? His essential diagnosis is that American society has traumatized and abused as well as miseducated the oppressed people in the United States to the point of making them suspicious, hostile, and impatient towards one another, resulting in the mistreatment of friends and potential friends as enemies. Yet paradoxically, while the abstract analysis Wright includes, often they're in like parenthetical statements that interrupt the action in the published version, paradoxically, though the abstract analysis implies fidelity, continued fidelity to the communist cause, the embodied action of the text reinforces a familiar ideological split in a kind of a binary opposition, right? Namely that one can either be an artist, intellectual, free thinker, or a committed organizer, Marxist, communist, revolutionary. You can't be both, right? I should just point out that, as is often the case with historical synecdoche, this account of May 1936 is misleading, factually. Chronologically speaking, Wright was deeply involved in supporting CP efforts well into the 40s. Not only would he remain a prolific contributor to the Daily Worker, he was the editor of the Daily Worker, a Communist Party-affiliated newspaper in Harlem. He was their editor well into the 40s. Wright also presided as the opening speaker of the June 1941 American Writers' Congress. This was the fourth anti-fascist conference organized by a coalition led by the CP. Right? This is 5 full years after this synecdoche would have him tossed out by his erstwhile comrades. Right? So the history of the autobiography is misleading in that respect. Nonetheless, while things don't end well in either version, the unpublished text of Black Confession does not so easily allow us to dismiss the movement to which Wright devoted perhaps his most productive decade in the way the published version tends to. Right, now we're getting towards the point. Black Confession complicates the picture, offering a rich, contradictory record of lessons and impressions Wright absorbed in the thick of a radical collective movement to change the world. Many of these lessons and impressions were flattened out or erased completely in the more harshly post-communist version we have now come to know. My argument is that Black Confession asks us to confront what I call Wright's critical communism versus the radical yet cynical anti-communist individualism found or too easily read into the published text. All right? To give a concrete example of what I'm after here, let's briefly compare Wright's treatment of one key episode in the published text of Black Boy American Hunger with how he treats the same episode in the archives of Black Confession. Here I do have some pages. I brought 10 copies of a 2-page handout, so if you came in a little late or whatever, perhaps we could pass those down. I'm going to ask you to help me decode some chicken scratch in a bit. Also, I might as well do this too. Here are just a few other rather randomly selected pages to give you a sense of what Wright's typescript pages often look like in terms of just like the kind of, specifically in the second half of the autobiography, just the amount that he reworked this autobiographical text. It's actually, and I should just point out that even the fact that he reworked the text significantly is a fact that has been misrepresented or ignored in the existing biographies, including Hazel Rowley's as well as Michael Faber's. They both kind of suggest Wright's first draft was the same as the last draft in one way or another, and that's just not true. Or it's not accurate, fully accurate. Okay, so the episode we're going to look at today has to do with radical magazines and also with Wright's mother, Ellen Wright. Right? A struggling working-class Black single mother as well as a former school teacher, Ellen Wright features centrally in part 1 of Black Boy. Right? She's, infamous for having beaten the young Wright to an inch of his life in the opening chapters of Black Boy. She's so afraid that he's going to get himself killed that she's famous for that scene and perhaps for a few others. But she plays only a marginal role in part 2. In both the published and the draft version, Richard's mother learns of her son's newfound communist involvement. It's a tough moment for any mother. After she discovers him reading a stack of radical magazines in their cramped Chicago apartment, materials Richard has been given by the local John Reed Club. They didn't even charge him $1. one of a number of worker writer centers established by the CPUSA during the early to mid-1930s. People know who John Reed was, right? The author of 10 Days That Shook the World, one of the very famous English language accounts of the Russian Revolution from 1917, right? So the party named a bunch of clubs after John Reed, and they were worker writer centers, right? They produced and they organized together, etc. In both versions, Black Confession and American Hunger, that's how I'm going to refer to them going forward, right? The young Richard is flush with enthusiasm for the new radical magazines. As he writes, the revolutionary words leapt from the printed page and struck me with tremendous force, he writes, adding that my attention was caught by the similarity of the experiences of workers in other lands, by the possibility of uniting scattered but kindred people into a whole. My cynicism, which had been my protection against a world that cast me out, slid from me, and timidly I began to wonder if a solution of unity was possible. Here at last, he continues, in the realm of revolutionary expression was where Negro experience could find a home. These magazines did not say, be like us and we will like you, maybe. It said, if you possess enough courage to speak out what you are, you will find that you are not alone. But Wright's revolutionary enthusiasm is quickly challenged, in both versions, by his mother's confusion and concern upon seeing the lurid and grotesque cartoons that dominate the covers of these radical magazines. Watching her, Wright reflects, my mother's face showed disgust and moral loathing. She was a gentle woman. Her ideal was Christ upon the cross. How could I tell her that the Communist Party wanted her to march in the streets, chanting, singing? In the published version of American Hunger, Wright's mother asks accusingly, what do the communists think people are? Which prompts Wright to, quote, fumble with words. Why do they print the stuff, she says. Maybe they don't know how to say what they mean, he says. Wright is unable to marshal a suitable response. Frustrated, he, quote, wonders whom I could convince of this if I could not convince my own mother. In the early version of the scene, however, literally scrawled on the backside of page 522 of Black Confession, and you have this in front of you, Ellen Wright puts to her son a different question. Not what do communists think people are, but rather, and here I'll quote the remarkable excise scene that follows at length, and I want to point out here, there are a few words here that I have made my best approximation on. So if your reading of this scene differs from mine, in terms of actual words, then I would appreciate hearing your
Is this the one
reading.
we're looking at?
Yeah, that and then that page and then the second. Yeah.
There's another copy.
Oh yeah, Julio definitely deserves a copy. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Okay. So the original question is, what do communists think people are, right? Right. And again, the cartoons he's referring to. Some of you, if you've seen old CP has anybody seen like old 30s Communist Party? Like iconography, it's often like there were a few artists who had a thing for kind of like kind of a hyper masculine. It wasn't always even necessarily just men depicted, but these like hyper like kind of muscular macho marching people, right? And so this kind of cartoon is what Ellen Wright reacts to. Okay, but so in the published version, she asks, "What do communists think people are?" Right? In the unpublished draft, she asks instead, "What do you think that communists can do for people?" She asked. They can free you. Only God can free you, she said. I'm talking about freedom in this world, I said. The white people own this world, she said. The people who print these magazines are white, I said. But what kind of freedom? She asked. Freedom to live like other people. If they take from other people to give to us, that's not freedom, she said. No, I said, but if you had the chance to own the means of producing the bread of life, then you'd be free. That'll never be for common people, she said. It is now in Russia, I said. Common people like you are building, learning trades, doctors, lawyers, pilots. Maybe that's all right for Russia, but they'll never let us do that here. No, they won't let us do it. But suppose we did it anyhow. That means war. It's war now, I said. I'm conquered, you're conquered. I don't want anybody to tell me what to do, my mother said. You've already been told what to do, and you've been doing it your whole life, I said. What do you mean, Richard? You give your blood, Mama, and you're black, and all your life you've agreed to live the life of a black woman. God will write that. All right, let him, I said. But pending his action, I'm going to do something. Don't get yourself killed, she said. That's the least of my worry. She left. This entire amazing scene was left out of the published version, leaving readers today with the impression that Ellen Wright merely threw up her hands at the militant whiff of revolution, scared off by literally the cartoon image of communism. In fact, you might read the published version of Part 2 and almost think that Ellen Wright was left down south along with Grandma, so little do they figure into the published text. It's different in the unpublished versions, both for grandma and mother. But the early drafts show that she was curious and interested, though of course still skeptical about the possibilities of revolution winning in a place like the United States, not to mention worried about her son. The scene is of interest for other reasons as well. It makes Wright's own internationalist, socialist, and revolutionary politics explicit, whereas in the published version of Black Boy American Hunger, they are murky at best, awkward often, and often totally submerged. More specifically, the scene emphasizes the importance for Wright of the example of the actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union, an experiment that expanded the realm of what could be imagined as possible even in the Jim Crow USA. Similarly, it draws out the importance for Wright of the example set by Russians or other white communists. However small their numbers, they prove that white people are not the racist monolith that they often appear to be, especially for someone who grew up as Wright did in a place like Natchez, Mississippi. The exceptions here matter, not because they suggest, and here I want to emphasize this, not because they suggest some white socialist savior is coming to the rescue, and not because they offer a way to universalize struggle through a race-blind concept of class. They matter because by exposing the divisions and potential comrades within the so-called white camp, they open up new possibilities for oppressed people to assert their own agency through alliances both national and international. Additionally, we should note that Wright here explicitly bases his idea of freedom to come, not just on like, we're all going to vote for change or something, right? On the collective seizure of the, quote, means of producing bread. And that he acknowledges rather than downplays the, quote, war that such a revolution will involve. Moreover, in everyday language that still remains relevant today, I would argue, Wright responds to his mother's knee-jerk anti-party concern that, quote, I don't want anybody to tell me what to do, not by denying the disciplined force that the Communist Party seeks to build, but rather by calling attention to the structural violence that already dominates her life. Right? Whether they want to be or not, working-class black folks, and perhaps women in particular, are already at war in the USA. In pointing to black people's status as conquered, Wright undercuts the anti-communist rhetoric that would uphold free choice in individualist America against coercive force of totalitarian communism. His comments suggest that there is no avoiding some level of dictated conditions, some level of being, quote, forced. The question is how and in whose interest, with what goals, that force will be used. Will it be used to defend oppressed people against attacks they face, to make sure everyone has enough to eat, or used to keep on grinding people's lives to dust so that a few may profit? Finally, the dialogue is notable for the ironic but gentle way in which Wright responds to his mother's devout Christianity, an approach that stands in stark contrast to memorable scenes earlier in Part 2, and Julio, you will probably remember this, right, where Wright witnesses the black Chicago communists in Union Square provoking but never convincing crowds of unemployed workers with performances of profanity-laced atheism aimed at disproving the existence of God. There's a Bob Avakian joke in here somewhere, but for those who follow this kind of stuff on the left. But they aim at disproving the existence of God rather than, say, winning people over to the political cause on the basis of their common concerns, religious beliefs and all, right, as they are, building unity. In both versions of the autobiography, Richard Wright reflects on his mother's rejection of the magazines with a memorable declaration of his critical revolutionary artistic mission, right? He sees he has a role to play here. Here, then, he says, was something I could do, reveal, say. The communists, I felt, had oversimplified the experience of those they sought to lead. In their efforts to recruit masses, they had missed the meaning of the lives of the masses, had conceived of people in too abstract a manner. I would make voyages, discoveries, explorations with words and would try to put some of that meaning back. I would address my words to two groups. I would tell communists how common people felt, and I would tell common people of the self-sacrifice of communists who strove for unity among them. This radical writer's manifesto appears more or less in both versions of the text. However, it is only in Black Confession that Wright suggests the existence of an underlying reality that makes this mission more than a naive pipe dream. An honest curiosity among both the common people and the party with respect to the other. In Black Boy American Hunger, this revolutionary mission is set up for failure, almost tripwired for failure would be my preferred term. Wright's mother is quick to condemn communism on the basis of cartoons, while the communists themselves are shown to be uninterested or incapable of listening to her as well. From a revolutionary point of view, the picture is doubly hopeless, right? The masses appear stuck in their ignorance, the communists stuck in their arrogance. In the published version of American Hunger, Wright's attempt to get his new comrades at the John Reed Club to take his mother seriously fall on deaf ears. She'll have to learn the symbolism of the revolution, he is told. The party is presented as a site of monologue, not dialogue, of lecturing, not listening. But in Black Confession, this time in the typescript, the John Reed Club comrades are not nearly so dismissive. The differences are subtle but significant. I told the group of my mother's reaction to the cartoon on the cover of the Masses, and we argued about it half the night. Some agreeing with me, with my mother, and others disagreeing. But we're just starting in this, Abe, the most articulate of the group, argued. You can't condemn this thing just because it's crude and its inception. We argued and drank beer. The takeaway in brief is not the beer, right? Although it's not irrelevant, right? The communists in the published version are kind of like inhuman. They're just like these people with ideas and no bodies and no personalities in most extent, right? But the point here is in the published version of American Hunger, Wright's depiction of this conflict between mother and magazine makers suggests a double blockage that makes the very idea of a genuinely transformative political process, right? A mutual transformation of the kind of talker and listener, party and people, reader and writer. It appears something between far-fetched and absurd, right, from the beginning. However, in the unpublished Black Confession version, Wright presents us with the outline of a genuine and potentially transformative dialogue between mother and magazine, common people, Communist Party, with Wright, the writer's son, as translator or would-be translator between. What the early version presents us with is a challenge, to be sure. The path ahead is fraught with danger and difficulty, but it's not a metaphysical impossibility. Right? We can imagine Ellen Wright, herself a former schoolteacher who had a lot to do with Wright learning to read so early, picking up some of these commie magazines and perhaps sending a letter to the editor complaining about the misogynist aesthetic, or whatever her terms would have been, right? Getting them to speak her language. The same question, in other words, appears in both texts, right? How could I tell my mother what the communists wanted, Wright writes in both versions. It appears in both versions of the text, but it takes on a radically different meaning in the two different contexts. Right? In Black Confession, the question reads as a genuine question that demands a concrete, practical answer. How could I tell my mother what the communists wanted? In Black Boy American Hunger, the question comes across more along the lines of a rhetorical question. Not a question at all, but a cynical statement. How could I tell my mother what the communists wanted? Right? As if to say, there is no imaginable way to ever bring such opposed people together. In the published version of Wright's autobiography, again and again, and there are many examples, the party is shown to be walled off from the people and vice versa, just as in the end, art and politics come to a kind of metaphysical impasse in the book's closing pages, when Wright, the individual writer, takes shelter from the masses and party on the march. But in the early drafts, there is an openness, a dialogue, a point of engagement, a site of struggle, full of challenges, but also potential. Yeah, potential that continues, I'd say, even after he falls out from the specific people in the Chicago CP. Right. One of the differences in the versions, too, is that the critique is much more located as like a problem with the Chicago CP than like the CP in general in the earlier version. In the lost pages of Black Confession, hundreds of pages of argument that literally went nowhere, there is the liberating suggestion that through dialogue, oppressed and working class people, mothers and sons, artists and comrades, are all capable of becoming more than they already are. And moreover, that radical art and culture, literature, magazines, even cartoons, can play a role in sparking and sustaining this much-needed dialogue, or in shutting it down. In glaring contrast with the individualist despair that concludes the published version of Wright's autobiography, the critical communist drafts of Black Confession reveal how the people and the party are both curious to learn more about the other, both reaching for a common language to communicate across barriers, breaking down the cartoonish stereotypes that divide them. That radical curiosity, visible in the early drafts, points to empowering possibilities that the published version of Black Boy American Hunger blocks from view. More than the published post-communist Richard Wright we think we now know, the suppressed Wright of Black Confession asks us to reflect critically but concretely, specifically, on the past experiences of would-be artist revolutionaries, while rekindling the spark of hope that drew Wright into these challenging conversations in the first place. Such conversations, I would argue, remain more crucial than ever in our present moment, an age of perpetual capitalist crisis where cynicism too often suppresses even the thought, let alone the utterance, that a radically different world might be not only necessary, but possible. Thank you. All right.
So, thank you, Joe, and I don't know if I remembered to thank all of you for coming. So I think I said my individual thanks and didn't thank all of you. So thank you, everybody, for coming. And I know that Joe is really interested in your comments,